So it is wonderful to offer our podcast to those who are a part of the family of United Christian Parish here in Reston, Virginia, and to those who are willing to venture into this experiment here as far as our podcast that is called Conversations in Color. The mission of Conversations in Color is a podcast to advance the story of United Christian Parish through this social platform that shares dialogue with the people who are cherished and respected as leaders, those offering their perspectives on the impact of their work as a solution to the important issues in our communities. Today, it is my pleasure to welcome to Conversations in Color once again, Sandhya Jha, who is an author, founder, and former executive director of the Oakland Peace Center. Sandhya is an ordained pastor with a master's in public policy. She is also a co-organizer trainer for pro-reconciliation and the anti-racism program for the Christian Church Disciples of Christ Reconciliation Ministry. Today, Sandhya is with us to discuss her most recent book, Rebels, Despots, and Saints, the ancestors who free us and the ancestors we need to free. And so we welcome Sandhya to this morning's podcast. And before we get started, as always, I also want to greet Kate Hoeing.
Hi.
Hi, Kate. We are always want to express our gratefulness to you, Kate, for the important work that you do. And among those is your assistance in producing this very podcast. So I'm glad that you are with us today. So Sandhya, again, welcome. How
Thanks.
Are you doing?
I'm holding up. I am keeping busy. I am so grateful both to you, Marcus, and to Kate. I don't know if your listeners know that you are the reason I am a core organizer trainer with pro-reconciliation and anti-racism. You are absolutely among the best I have ever come across at doing this work. And I am so grateful for all you've taught me over the years.
Kate, did we increase that amount of that check that we're sending to Sandhya this week?
We did.
Good. Thank you, Sandhya. You are very kind. You're a dear sister. We don't talk enough, but quite often we're in gathering spaces such as this, meeting spaces where we get to greet each other.
Yeah.
And as a part of the work that we do with our church and with our community. So, but always it's good to see you. And you have been with us before. You have played this game, Would You Rather, before. And so it is important to let those who may be listening with us for the first time to know that this game that is rather popular for some folks, Would You Rather, but this is our intent to just have a bit of fun with those who are our guests on the podcast. And so Sandhya is going to try this game with us again. And how this game is played is to imagine having two scenarios and having to decide upon only one of them. Sometimes neither of the two scenarios seem to provide a good resolution. And then again, sometimes both of the scenarios seem to be especially good. But the task for this game, Would You Rather, is always the same, choosing only one of the two scenarios that is presented. So Sandhya, are you ready to play?
I am ready.
I hear it in your voice. Would you rather be able to go back in time and change one historical event, or see 200 years into the future, but not be able to change anything? So Sandhya, your answer, and as always, the follow-up question to your answer. Tell us why.
This one is super hard because, you know, every TV show about space travel or time travel is always about how if you mess anything up in the timeline, it ruins everything. And on the flip side, I got friends who were, you know, working really hard on addressing the climate crisis. And they're like, we are not convinced we have 100 years, far less 200. And I don't want to know if that's the case, because I'd rather be focused on doing the work than, getting information that might cause me to give up. Because I live in hope, and I think that nothing is set in stone for the future. So even though I know the risks inherent in this, if I could go back in time and change one thing,
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking I would like to have a conversation with Paul to say, hey, I know that you like women and think that women have a role in the church, but there are some folks who are going to stick some stuff into your letters that makes it sound like you don't. Is there a way that you could be more explicit about how men and women and people across the gender spectrum are all part of God's plan and ministry? And could you also sneak in some stuff that makes it really clear that exploitation of people is really a sin in the eyes of God? So that's, I think, what I would do, because I like to think that would have some ripple effects that would be really helpful for us down the road.
I think that's probably excellent insight, Chanda. I was thinking about the passage as you were just sharing that, and I wanted to just take a look, because I'm thinking it's 1 Corinthians in chapter 14, and that was the chapter where it gets often misrepresented. When Paul speaks about the women and the women being silent in the churches, and the misrepresentation is that Paul is asking that, so to speak, as kind of a question, but it's not the question that he doesn't, so to speak, already have the answer to.
Right.
Women should keep silent in the church. Of course not.
Right.
Did the word of God begin with you?
Right.
And even more, he uses the feminine article, hey, which often is referring to when you speak about, so to speak, I think it was the feminine nominative case. And so it even there, it is the representation that he is saying that it's a ridiculous idea to think that women should not have leadership in the church, that they shouldn't have voice in the church. It's almost like I'm not sure if I'm thinking correctly, but it's again, I'm not thinking of that word at the moment, but it's where the question itself, so to speak, is almost maybe hypothetical or something, but it's this sense to where, of course, the leadership of women belong to the church. So anyway, I agree. That would be one thing that would probably save this church from centuries of painful delineation or discernment that's needed and still needed, unfortunately. But I also think about the other aspect of it, where to think about something 200 years from now and being in the position of knowing whatever it is we're doing right now, it ain't gonna work. And hope is a wonderful member of the other Trinity, mystery, faith, hope.
That's right.
But it was never intended to be a plan.
Right. It was supposed to be an impetus.
Yeah. So what are we doing now, Chanda? now that we have basically enlightened all of our listeners, what are we doing for the next 40 minutes?
We can just call it.
Okay. No, we're supposed to talk about your book.
Oh, that's a good idea. Let's do that then.
We're supposed to talk about your book. So we've chosen to call this podcast Conversations in Color. because it is a metaphor that describes in-depth discussions having a lasting impact on our lives. Sandhya, the focus of your book, most recent writing, Rebels, Despots, and Saints, are, as you refer to it, the learnings about our web of ancestors that bring a rich tapestry of stories into our lives. You compile a number of conversations for this book, interesting conversations, intriguing, but also some that were very stirring.
Yeah.
Some in some very hopeful ways, and then some had some real pain to them. So I want to ask, what was your most memorable, so to speak, conversation in color among the people that you interviewed for this book? And can you tell us about it?
You know, it's interesting because one of the things I did, and this was kind of a grand experiment and it turned out beautifully, was I hosted 2 different wisdom circles, and each of those wisdom circles met monthly for a year. And one of them was for people of color and one of them was for white people. And it was interesting because I would propose similar questions to each group, and where we went in each group was very, very different in really powerful ways. There was a question I asked early on to both groups around who were some ancestors whose stories people tried to hide from you? What were some of the stories that maybe the family thought were embarrassing? And it was fascinating because the people of color stories were often, I had an auntie who knew traditional medicine. And because we had been told by missionaries that that was, you know, satanic, we wrote her out of the stories. Or one of my favorite stories, and I wrote it, and my editor, who was phenomenal, cut this story out. So I'm super sad about that. One of my good friends said, you know, I didn't realize that my family from this small town in Texas were just such troublemakers. They were legendary. That particular family name, everybody knew it because they were the ones who were always breaking stuff and starting fights and, you know, just running roughshod. But he said, tiny little town, my family was Black. There was one time the sheriff showed up at my great-great-grandmother's house and said, I arrested your son. I need you to come pick him up because if the rest of your family finds out he's in jail, it is not worth my life. And so I love the fact that this should have been an embarrassing story, but what it says is my family rolled deep for each other, right? And I love that on the surface, they were a pain in the butt. They were misbehaved. They didn't know how to do right.
Yeah.
But in an incredibly racist town in Texas, all those years ago, this Black family had enough power that the white sheriff was like, take him off my hands. I do not want to die this way. And I love that, right? So that was what was beautiful, is in the people of color stories, we ended up tapping into what we were supposed to be ashamed of versus what we realized was shameful was in the world around us, right? What was shameful was the missionaries saying your ancestral wisdom, the learning how to use the plants in your community, telling us that that was evil. Well, that was the missionaries who should be ashamed, or their descendants should be ashamed of those ancestors. We shouldn't have had to be ashamed. What was interesting was in the white people's circle, there was more of a mixture of stories. Sometimes it was, I had an ancestor who stood up against the forces of evil. I had one person shared a story of a great-great-grandfather of hers who had been killed by Confederate soldiers during the Civil War. And it was because he wouldn't join with the Confederacy, even though he lived in the South and was a white man. And that story got erased from her lineage because even though he was on the right side of history, he had been a troublemaker. And that's not how you survive. And that's not how you function within a culture of white supremacy. Resisting white supremacy comes at too much of a cost. They didn't want to pass that lesson of a troublemaker in their lineage, right? So I think that that's, and simultaneously, there were also, I had ancestors who were enslavers. I had ancestors who, one person who talked about the key role his stepfather played in the Southern Strategy by Richard Nixon, and how as he engages the memory of his stepfather, he has to wrestle with, he caused a whole bunch of harm and he loved me. What do I do with that, right? So it was really interesting that the conversations that emerged in those two different circles, some of my friends joked with me that I was segregating my conversation partners, but it created freedom. I mean, you know this because we do caucusing and anti-racism work where people of color have conversations with each other and white folks have conversations with each other so that we can come back together better.
Yeah.
And I think that I've always known why that was valuable for people of color, because I'm always in the people of color caucus, and kind of white folks often come back kind of exhausted from their caucusing.
Mhm.
This was a remarkable experience where the white folks were like, oh my gosh, we get to talk about our stuff without being disrespectful to people of color. We get to talk about the harm we've experienced without taking time away from people of color. The white folks experienced it as a gift as well. And it's interesting because, I mean, there's an irony in that the folks who were showing up were all committed to racial justice. That was part of why they were showing up. And it was a gift to not have to translate for each other so that they could each go deep in ways they couldn't have when they were trying to take care of and protect each other. And it does mean we come back together better, because I really do believe in a multiracial, anti-racist community. It was just striking to me how much depth of relationship and how much healing could happen when we took a little bit of time to delve deep into our own stuff with other people who had similar experiences.
Well, I think that's a part of the reason that you and I have continued with this, Shonda, in terms of the pro-reconciliation, anti-racism work, is because it is freeing work.
It is.
As you said in your book, it is freeing work. It frees all of us. And sometimes those who are on both, so to speak, sides of those caucusings, the people of color, as well as those who are white, there are these stories that have the capacity to free us, which is a part very much of what your book is about, certainly more, but in terms of its in-depthness, but it is about these stories that free us. And even now, as you talk about it, among those are these stories of bravery, right?
Yeah.
Bravery that happens for those who are white, that they can hold on to. In our workshops or trainings or whatever you want to call them, we talk about the importance of reclaiming stolen stories.
Yes.
Which is so much a part of your book in terms of that. Even as you talked about the editor, but the sense of having one of those stories basically edited out for the sake of the work itself, the book itself. But you know, even myself, there are these stories. A story of my grandmother in this small, poor town in North Carolina. My grandmother, who wasn't even 5 feet tall, but how she went to the sheriff's office, and my dad had just come home from Vietnam, and his driver's license had expired, and I had just been born. I was in the hospital, and my dad was sitting in the jail cell, and my grandmother marches in there and basically just says that my dad, you know, that he had better be out of the jail and ready to leave when she was ready to leave. And he was.
That's amazing.
So, we have these stories and
And they can be empowering, right? Like knowing that that's who you come
Yes.
from matters, doesn't it?
Yeah, so Henry Louis Gates Jr. and yet, who do you think you are?
Yeah.
And so we are these stories,
Yeah.
we are these stories. And so I just think that that's so much a part of the importance of your book and what your readers will take from it. You have a really pressing day, Shonda, but I want to ask this question and kind of get to maybe one or two others before we have to let you go.
Sure.
But in your book, you describe this intricate process of discernment. And I'd like for you to maybe share a little bit more for our audience so that they will have a sense of it when they go online to purchase your book at the low price of, what is it now?
It's $19.99.
At the low price of $19.99. So you talk about stories and you kind of categorize them for your reader. So this process: stock stories, concealed stories, creating counter storytelling, resistance stories that are emerging, transforming towards the impetus of action change. So let's start with the first one. Tell us, what are stock stories?
Yeah, and I need to give credit where credit's due. I believe it's Leanne Bell who created the storytelling project model, and the organization she works with gave me permission to use this methodology, and I use it all over the place. I've used it in book groups. I've used it in organizing places. I'm part of an organizing campaign, and the person who's leading it just read my book and messaged me and said, "Oh, can we use the storytelling project model in how we do community organizing with this specific campaign?" Which I love. I love that we can apply this in practical ways. So stock stories are the stories we're told that that are unnuanced, that maybe put the people in power in a good light. The old stories like, in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, or the story of the first Thanksgiving where Indians and pilgrims shared a meal in harmony, or, the story of the great frontier and all of the, American know-how and fortitude that created that experience. Those would be the stock stories that don't tell what's going on underneath, that just tell the big broad strokes.
So Shonda, what about those that we are familiar with? We've been in certain gatherings when we've been doing and having these conversations, and someone would say, "Well, there you go again, damning our ancestors."
Yeah, it's interesting because this comes up every Columbus Day, where somebody's like, "I'm Italian. Why are you trying to take away my ancestors?" And I'm like, "Do you know how many?" Am I allowed to say badass?
You just did it. Don't worry about it.
Do you know how many badass Italian ancestors you have? You have anti-fascist ancestors. You have ancestors who invented things. You have ancestors who can cook some of the best food on the planet. Why would you not want to claim the ancestors who were part of resistance movements, ancestors who created great art, ancestors who were part of radical feminist movements? There are a lot of really cool Italian ancestors. Columbus probably in your blood anyhow. If you're just choosing a cultural ancestor, there are so many cool Italian ancestors to choose from.
Yes.
So I think that that's one of the things that's really interesting is sometimes it feels like an attack on white folks. It might be an attack on whiteness, because whiteness was constructed in order to consolidate power and take away white folks' ancestors in the process. So when we start looking at other stories, there are really inspiring stories of, you know about Bacon's Rebellion. There were white indentured servants joining up with black enslaved folks to take on the plantation owners. Those are some ancestors you want to claim. The folks who were part of the Haymarket riot, they were European immigrants who were like, we are done with our labor being exploited, and they risked and lost their lives to fight for the weekend.
Right.
Those are some ancestors you want to claim. There's some really, really exciting stories.
Well, there's some exciting things that you write about in your book when you speak about the opportunity to, so to speak, choose in terms of those who we can claim as well as part of our stories, and do it in an authentic way.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that we definitely need to wrestle with our biological ancestors, but we do have ancestors who are from our cultural background. And for those of us who are committed to justice, and this book was kind of my love letter to activists, for those of us who are committed to doing justice in the world, we've also got ancestors from the social justice movement, right? I have learned so much from people like Harvey Milk and Rosa Parks and Ella Baker and Mahatma Gandhi and Cesar Chavez, Gustavo Gutierrez. He's still alive, so he's an elder rather than an ancestor. But like, there are so many people who have done amazing things to take on injustice that I get to learn from them, and those get to be my ancestors as well.
Amen. Amen. So you also mentioned others, concealed stories. What are concealed?
Yeah. So when we just stick with the stock stories, what often gets ignored is the suffering, right? So when we talk about the great American frontier, the attempted eradication of indigenous people is the concealed story. We know more and more about it now, but there are an awful lot of individual stories, especially on the land that we specifically inhabit, right? If I think of myself as I live in Oakland, I don't always think about the Ohlone people who got displaced so that people who were not indigenous could live here. If I think of this as Wichin, which is the Ohlone name for this land, it gets me thinking a little bit differently about whose land this is, the ancestors that belong to this landscape. So those are the concealed stories, is the harm that was caused. But the interesting thing is sometimes we've gotten better at telling the concealed stories. I think people are increasingly aware of the suffering that colonization caused, the suffering that enslavement caused, the suffering that empires cause. What we don't always tell are the stories of resistance. In every case where there was suffering and oppression, there were people fighting back in a million different ways. And those stories are important too, because like I said, it's important for us to know that as early as 1676, Black enslaved folks were saying, we will not put up with this. It is also really important for white folks to know that there were white folks who were standing with Black folks and fighting back too. So I think these resistance stories matter because they do connect us to what our ancestors did to make the world a better place. And a lot of the reason we live in a better world than that one is because of often unnamed folks who fought back and didn't put up with the conditions that were imposed on them.
Thanks, Shonda. So you mentioned this other, creating counter storytelling. And as you talk about that, what does it also mean in terms of the efforts to create these counter storytelling efforts in the face of adversity, such as the Ron DeSantis and others,
right?
And this kind of hypocrisy in regards to their opposition to wokeness.
Right. I think it's worth unpacking the term wokeness and maybe not.
Only you have enough time to do that unpacking for us, Shauna.
Yeah, I won't do it right now, but I think that's part of our job at some point. It's funny because I think this is what comes up with, the term PC also is, are you saying that you want permission to be hurtful to other people? Because that's a strange request to make. If you're saying, the PC police are a problem, what is it you want to say? What is it that you think you should be saying that people are taking away from you? Is it that you think you want to say the N-word? Is it that you want to defame people who are dealing with mental health issues? Are those things you want to be doing? I think it's interesting to not seed the frame, right?
Right.
I'm not going to defend political correctness. I'm going to ask what it is that you want to get away with. When we talk about wokeness, I think, what is it that you think didn't happen that we're naming? Where is it that you think we're being inaccurate? So what I think is really exciting about counter storytelling is telling those stories of resistance, telling the concealed stories, telling the stories of resistance from our history, and then connecting them to what's going on now. We often do a timeline of history in our anti-racism trainings. I do a little bit of a variation on that. It's a river of history exercise. And everybody can pick up a piece of paper with information on the back of it about a various, whatever piece of history on race they don't already know a lot about. And they talk with their table mates about what they hadn't known until they read that piece of paper. And then they connect it to something that's going on today. And I think that matters because if they picked up the piece of paper about Ozawa versus the United States, which was about Asian immigrants specifically, but immigrants not being given access to the vote in 1921, I think that case was 1920. Right. Is that right?
I think that's right.
To say, so how does that connect here? It gives you a chance to talk about how Latinos had to fight for their right to the vote in Texas in this decade, right? That case went to the Supreme Court. There were Black folks in North Carolina and Latinos in Texas that came together in a joint case that went to the Supreme Court because they were being disenfranchised. So if we look at these pieces of resistance history of where people stood up against injustice way back when, and then we say, so what's going on today? Where are people resisting today? Where are people pushing for a different world today from that same lineage? It gives us a connection. It gives us a place to apply the stories of our ancestors. It also reminds us that the things that are going on today are the same level of stakes. Because when it's just part of the air we breathe, it's easy to be like, basically our voting rights are intact, right? I'm not sure why they're making such a fuss. People generally get to vote. That doesn't feel like a big threat. When you connect it back to a long history, you realize, oh, this is part of something bigger, and this moment also matters. So, yeah, I think that that's a real gift we get to give each other and ourselves.
So how does action happen?
Yeah.
As the model speaks of, action change.
That's right. That's right. So what I love about this model is, so you talk about the stock story. Columbus discovered the Americas, and that's in air quotes. The concealed story is all of the suffering, the disease, the harm, the decimation of populations, the desecration of land and sacred places. The resistance stories are, even from the very first time, we do, if we tell the concealed stories, sometimes say these poor innocent people who didn't, fight back got wiped out. But there were people fighting back against Columbus from his earliest arrival, and those stories matter. And it's interesting because that gives us a chance to think about things like the Land Back campaign, where Indigenous people are saying, actually, we're the stewards of this land. It's important for us to continue to be the stewards. Things like the Dakota Access Pipeline case, the water is life. Line 3 up in Minnesota, where Indigenous people today are saying, we are the caretakers of this land. You will not destroy it because this land and this water are sacred, that's going on today. And so that gives us a chance to say, well, where might I be able to show up and support that work? I care about the water and land. I'm a Christian. It is my birthright to be invested in the thriving of God's creation. If these folks are leading that charge, and this is in fact their land, that gives me an opportunity to engage with that campaign and to engage in it with the humility of not trying to be another Columbus, right? So I think there is something about paying attention to how those stories of resistance show up in the present and finding our role within them. And that's where our own ancestors can be helpful. I have Asian ancestors from not that long ago, when the Asian student movement of the 1970s, which worked in solidarity with the Black Panther Party and with the Brown Berets and with the American Indian movement. The fact that people of all of these different cultural backgrounds came together around anti-war work, around environmental stewardship, as well as around racial justice, as well as around economic justice. What was the name of the white folks from West Virginia who moved up to Chicago and were doing organizing? The Black Panther Party trained them. I cannot think of the name of it right now, but we all
I can't
have,
help it at the moment either.
but we all have ancestors who showed up with each other to support each other's movements. The fact that the Black Panther Party was like, hey, poor white folks from West Virginia, we want to support you, is not a story that gets told very much. And it's one that we have some things to learn from.
So Shonda, in your book's title, Rebels, Despots, and Saints, among these three, who's your favorite?
You know, it's interesting because rebels and saints might be a false separation, right? Because a lot of those rebels really are saints. And, you know, the reason I called it that was we've got complicated ancestors. And most of us have more oppressed than oppressor in our background. But most of us also have people who collaborated with the oppressors for our survival, for our family's betterment. And those are stories we have to wrestle with. So we might not have despots in our ancestry, but we probably have people who supported the despots. And we've got to wrestle with what that means and what we can learn from that and how we can position ourselves so we don't have to collaborate with our oppressors. And I think we often get the stories of the rebels erased because they're embarrassing, because the folks who want to keep us safe know that sticking our necks out doesn't keep us safe, and they don't want us to know the stories of the troublemakers, of the rebels. So I definitely have a soft spot for them. And sometimes the folks we've been told are saints are not, because we've only gotten a stock story. And some of the folks we weren't told were saints actually are. And so I think that I love that you invited me to think about that, because I don't know that I've unpacked it that carefully, but I think that we have a little bit of a mixture of all of those in our backgrounds, and that gives us a lot to wrestle with, come to terms with, and also find power and strength from.
Mine are the rebels.
I believe it.
Mine are the rebels for the various reasons that you talked about, you know, that often the rebels are not necessarily as eager to tell their stories. But the reason that they're out in front sometimes aren't as easily identified. Sometimes it's not that they wanted to be out in front.
Right.
It was that nobody else would.
Yep.
It's also in the Black community where there's a reason why when they refer to some of the clergy in the church, not so much now, but decades ago, centuries ago, sometimes they would refer to their pastors as Rev.
Yeah.
Not
Yes.
Rev, not Rev.
Yeah,
Rev.
you're right.
And it was a term of endearment because they knew what that leadership meant to them and to others in their community. If nobody else was going to be the rebel, the reverend was.
Yes.
And so it wasn't Rev, it was Reb.
Yep.
And
I love that.
some people mistook that as the dysfunction of understanding and of being able to articulate the language.
Mm-hmm.
But it was very much deliberate.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that so much. That's beautiful. It's interesting because as you're telling that story, I find myself thinking about Vernon Johns, who was Martin Luther King's predecessor.
Right.
And they were not always excited because he absolutely was a reb.
Exactly.
And so they wanted someone who was going to be better behaved. So they got rid of him and brought in Dr. King. I love that so much.
Yeah. They knew what they were doing, didn't they?
Yeah. Despite themselves, they couldn't
Yes.
help but do the right thing.
Yes. So I know that that we need to let you go. One more question, Shonda, and take as much time as you can. Can you describe the feelings that inspired your convictions that we aren't whole without the full story of not only our ancestral DNA, but as we were saying earlier, but also the opportunity of the stories of others that we can include for authentic reconciliation? For example, the stories that you wrote about in one of your chapters of the stories of Roger Taney and Lynn Jackson. And maybe tell us a little bit about that, enlighten us a bit.
Yeah, this is one of those, when people are like, why are you trying to make me think about people in my history who are bad? This is such a great example of the beauty that can come from wrestling with even our messiest ancestors, even the ancestors who did harm. So if you ever visit the courthouse in St. Louis, there's a statue of Dred Scott and his wife facing away from the courthouse because you know this already, but Dred Scott and his family had been enslaved, but the family who enslaved them had been in a free state for enough time that he technically counted as free. And so when he said, hey, I've been in, I want to say it was Kansas, long enough that I'm actually free now. This went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, no matter where in the United States you are, even if it's in a free state, if you're enslaved, you're enslaved.
Right.
And the case was first heard in St. Louis, which is why the statue's there. And Judge Taney was the head of the Supreme Court who made that decision.
Mm-hmm.
Many, many years later, one of the descendants of Justice Taney wrote a play about that and wrote a play imagining the fullness of the stories of those people and acknowledging the brutality of that moment and of the many years after it. And invited some of Dred Scott's descendants to come to the play, and they began to form relationships, and they began to get together every year. And at one point, the descendants of Justice Taney were like, hey, there's a statue of him in Annapolis. We want to tear it down. What's interesting is the descendants of Dred Scott were like, I don't know if that's the solution. And as they worked out something together, they came up with the idea of a statue of Dred Scott facing Justice Taney so that into perpetuity, he would be held accountable. Before they had a chance to do that, the effort to tear down the statues of harmful folks from our history got there first, so that statue's down. But over the years, those descendants, and you talked about Roger Taney and Lynn Jackson, they visit college campuses, they go speaking all across the country about what it can look like to make right the sins of our fathers so that we can be in more full relationship. And the main reason they say to do it, that they do it, is because it allows them to be in deep and meaningful relationship. And if they ignored that history, they would never be able to really experience that depth of connection. And I think that that's an amazing result of actually confronting, even when our ancestors do harm, there is amazing good that we can make from it. And that might actually be what we're called to.
Yeah. And I was just thinking about, even with that Tanny versus that decision, with Dred Scott, the stories
Yeah.
of resistance
Yep.
that I'm not sure it was the grandson
Mm-hmm.
of Judge Warren,
Mm-hmm.
who was the only dissenting voice in that case.
Yes.
And he became the Chief Justice
Yep.
for the 1954 Brown versus the Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas.
Yep. Yep.
And the sense of divine, I believe, divine presence,
Yeah.
and what it meant for him to be in that place
Yes.
at that moment, to
To be
be
carrying out his
yes,
legacy.
yes,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
yes.
I love that. Yeah.
Well, Shonda, thank you for your time with us. As always, when you come, you bless us with your stories, with your presence, your intellect that just lightens up the place. So we want to say again, thank you, and our best wishes to you and the work you're doing with Without Fear Consulting. And if
Thank you,
people
friend.
want to be in touch with you, just tell us again how folks can do that.
Yeah, I think the easiest
And
place to
where
find
to buy your book, the best place to get your book.
I love it. So if you're looking for the book, it is published by Chalice Press, and that's a nonprofit denominational press that is committed to doing God's work of justice in the world. So if you go to the Chalice Press website or order it from your local bookstore,
Yeah.
because it is always great to support our local bookstores where they keep the money in the community. Or get your library to order you a copy, because libraries helped raise me. And so I'm a fan of libraries.
Yes.
So that's another option. If you want to connect with me, I do a weekly newsletter called Joy in Justice, around diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace. And you can sign up for that at withoutfearconsulting.com. That would be an easy place to find me.
Thanks, Shonda. Well, best wishes as you rush from here. I think last time you were with us, you were on your way to the airport.
Oh my gosh, that's right.
So,
That's true.
so it's good to know that, we get to catch you, in between these transitions. So,
Love it. It was
best
such a
wishes.
gift to be with you, Marcus and Kate. Thanks so much.
You're very welcome, Shonda. Take care.
Take care.